Hello again and welcome back to our course on Excel 2013 Advanced. In this section we're going to start to look at tables. Now generally speaking, the data that you see on a worksheet in a workbook in Excel 2013 is tabular data. But when we talk about using tables in Excel 2013, we're talking about a particular structure within a worksheet where we define a range of cells within the worksheet to be a table. Now when we do that, we get a lot of advantages. The range we've defined, the table that we've created, can be formatted very simply. We have additional commands on a contextual tab that we can use to process the content of the table, and some functions we can perform, such as removing duplicates, become very straightforward. Now I'm going to show you many of those advantages in this and the following sections. Now in order to demonstrate the use of tables, I'm going to use part of the invoice that we were working on earlier in the course. The order details section, which has a border around it here, seems ideally suited to being a table. We have several rows, each row is an order item, and then several columns. Each column represents a different piece of information about each of the order items. Now let's suppose that I want to turn this tabular section, the section with the border around it, into a table. Well, it's straightforward enough, as you'll see in a moment, but I want to warn you about something first, and that is that when you are going to treat part of a worksheet, maybe all of a worksheet, as a table, you should avoid having merged cells included. Here we've got merged cells, so for instance with columns D to F, the rows here are merged on those columns. So the first thing I'm going to do is to remove the merging of the fields. Now the merging was done much earlier on in the life of this invoice, and in fact it now serves no useful purpose. The order details heading, which is outside the table, that's a merged cell as well. It doesn't matter about merged cells outside the table, it's only the ones inside the table that you need to avoid. Okay, so what I've done now is to unmerge those cells. I've left order details, which is outside the table, as a merged cell. In theory, what you need to do now is to select the cells that are going into the table and do an insert table. But in fact, Excel 2013 is pretty clever at this sort of thing. And if I just click on one of the cells within what I want to be a table, see what happens when I click on Insert Table. What Excel 2013 does is to work out where it thinks the border of the table should be, and it displays that as a range in the Create Table dialog that you can see here. So it's suggesting that the table I want is B6 to H14. B6, H14. Now in fact that's going to leave out this total row, and I could, if I wanted to, change that to say H15. Now I'm not going to do that at the moment because I want to show you a different way of using tables, so I'm going to leave it as H14, even though it's going to chop off this little bit at the bottom here. The other very important thing to note about the Create Table dialog is that Excel reckons that we've got headers there, and it's checked my table has headers, and of course our table does have headers here. Each column has its own header, so that's correct. If it had missed them, or if it thinks it had identified headers and there weren't any, I'd need to change the setting there, but on this case it's got it just right. Yes, this table does have headers, so I can click on OK. And there we are, it's actually created our table, and it looks pretty smart, I think. As you can see, it's already got some auto formatting, so I've got banded rows, and in the top left here it's also given the table a name. It says their table name. Now I'm going to change that table name. It's pretty easy, just click in there, and I'm going to call it Order Details, and changing the name of a table is as straightforward as that. So let's look at some of the features that we get once we've turned this range into a table. First of all, we automatically get a filter drop down in each of the headers. If I take description for an example, I've got a little drop down there, click on that, and I get not only a straightforward way of filtering on the descriptions of each of the parts, But I also get regular text filters. So for instance, click on text filter, and if I went for contains text filter, if I said contains door handles, click on OK, then I'll find all of the entries that contain door handles. Note as usual that you get a little filter symbol there to indicate that the filter's applied, and if I want to unapply the filter, click there, and then all I've got to do is say clear filter, and I'm back to where I started from. And while we're looking at those headers, what's something really quite clever here? If you look at the top of the columns here, note it says A, B, C, D, E, F, G, etc. in the usual way that you get with Excel. What I'm going to do now is to scroll down this worksheet. Now, I've only got about 8 or 9 rows in this table at the moment. It's not a very long table, but of course it's quite feasible that this would be a hugely long table, and I might need to scroll a long way down. Now watch what happens. I'm going to scroll down a row at a time. Watch what happens as the header row, quantity, part number, etc. gets towards the top there. It's right below BCD now. Now watch what happens. I actually get those titles appearing to replace BCD, etc. so that when I'm much farther down the table, I can identify very easily which column each of these corresponds to. I think that's a pretty neat feature, really. Now let's look at some of the features of the Table Tools Design tab. I've already shown you how to change the table name, and in the next section we're going to look at resizing a table. There are 2 or 3 ways of doing this. A couple of the commands in the next group, the Tools group, summarize with Pivot Table and Insert Slicer. We're going to talk about pivot tables later on in the course, but I'd like to look now at Remove Duplicates. So let's bring up the Remove Duplicates dialog. Now the basic principle on which this Remove Duplicates dialog works is that you tell Excel how to identify a duplicate. Now you may say, for example, that when I say duplicate, I mean that every single column in 2 rows is the same. Let's suppose that we had here a list of people, perhaps customers, first name, last name, zip code or postcode, date of birth. Let's suppose that we would define a duplicate as being a row which had exactly the same value in every single column as another row. Now that's a pretty straightforward kind of duplicate to identify, but in many cases you may consider a duplicate to only need 1 or 2 of the columns to be the same. Now in the case of our order, we might say, well, any 2 rows that have the same part number are clearly duplicates because you'd only expect the same part number to appear once in an order. In reality, of course, the person making the order may have been making it in such a way that they did duplicate part numbers and that there were quite legitimately 2 different order detail entries for the same part. But for the purposes of this example, let's assume that a duplicate part number really is a duplicate and we want to get rid of one of the duplicates. Now the way that we specify which columns constitute duplicate evidence, so if the only evidence we need is the same part number, we only need to tick the part number column to identify a duplicate. Now in that case that's just 1 column, so if I unselect all of those cells and just tick part number, then it really will just consider that if the part number is the same, it's a duplicate. So what it should do here is to delete one of these 2 rows that's got 25189 in it. Here's a word of warning though. There is another duplicate under the same conditions. In fact, there are 2 more duplicates because the empty rows count as duplicates as well. Now from the point of view of our table, we don't really need 3 empty rows because, as you're going to see in the next section, it's very easy to add rows to a table. We don't need lots of blank rows sitting here waiting. So when we actually push the button on removing duplicates, we're going to lose 2 of those blank rows as well. So let's click on OK and see what happens. And sure enough, it says 3 duplicates found and removed, 5 unique values remain. So what it's done, you can see it's not only deleted one of the duplicate rows, but it's actually got rid of 3 blank rows, because of course an extra blank row arose because of deleting that duplicate. So click on OK, and our table is now reduced in size with, in effect, 3 less rows than it had before. So let's move along the Table Tools Design tab again. There's an option here, External Table Data, with an Export button. Main option there is Export Table to SharePoint Lists. Now, SharePoint lists are outside the scope of this course, but if you do use SharePoint, that is the facility you can use to get the contents of any one of these Excel 2013 tables into a SharePoint list. Now let's move on to the Style options. Most of the things to do with style I'm going to look at later on, because I'm going to take a look at these table styles in a little bit more detail. But one of the things that I did before, you can see the poor lost total row there that was left behind and not included in the table. I can automatically have a total row included. If I check that checkbox, I get a total row. And I get a heading that says total, and then in each of these cells I can have a formula. Now most of them are empty except for the last one, and the last one has in it a subtotal 103, total price formula. Let's just see how that works. So if I click on the little drop down to the right of the cell that currently says 5, I can see a list of functions, and the selected function is the one that Excel 2013 has applied in this case, and it's applied the count function. So it's actually counting the number of rows. There are 5 rows there, obviously not including the header. 4 of them have prices in and 1 of them doesn't, but there are 5 rows. If what I really wanted was the total, I'd need to choose the sum function. So if I click on sum, I of course get a total of £95.83. So I can now get rid of that couple of cells we had down there. We no longer need those. We've now got a perfectly working total within the table. Now generally speaking, for the other cells in the total row, if I click in, say, that one, I can see that it's currently empty. If I click on the little drop down there, I can see that there's none, so it's not doing any kind of totaling or working out a max or a min or an average or anything else. But I can apply one of these functions and formulae to any one of those totals. So let's take the first column, for example. Supposing I wanted to actually know the total number of items in the order. If I click in there, click on the drop down, what I really want, if I do a sum here, is to see the total number of items. So we've got 2 of those, 1 of those, 4 of those, 1 of those. It should be 8 items. So click on the sum, and sure enough I can see that the number of items in the order is 8, and the total price of those 8 items, £95.83. So there are a couple of other things on the design tab here. I can have banded columns as well as, or instead of, banded rows if I want, for instance. So click on banded columns if I would like banded columns. But more of styles later on. And the only other thing to point out here is that the filter button is actually an option. If you don't want the filter buttons in the header, you can switch them on and off using that checkbox. In the next section, I'm going to look at inserting columns, inserting rows, changing the size of the table in general. So please join me for that.